If you're at all familiar with my work, you know that I love to quote Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky. And it's my favorite definition of leadership. Leadership is disappointing your own people at a rate they can absorb. It says the challenge of leadership is actually having to take people where they resist going. And for many of us, this is actually the place where the better preacher we are can keep us from being a good leader. So I say I work at a seminary, and every single person who comes to seminary, somebody said to them, "You're the best Christian I know. You should go pro. You should go off to professional Christian school." And they do. They come to school. I work at Fuller Seminary. People show up in Pasadena, or today more and more, they show up online. And we teach them everything we can, and they write papers, and they rethink a lot of things, and they learn a bunch of stuff, and they get finished, and they got a master of divinity. Literally, they sound like a superhero, right? And then they go back into their congregation, and that if they end up being a pastor in a church, they end up standing in front of that congregation every single week doing something that most people say is the most frightening thing they can do. Like up there with like fear of death and fear of loss is fear of speaking in front of groups. So the old joke is that at any funeral, half the people would rather be the person in the box than the person at the podium. And yet you start realizing that when you do a good job preaching, wonderful things can happen, and God can use it, and the Spirit of God's at work. And I really believe that especially the preaching event is part of the work of the Holy Spirit in the life of a congregation. But very often, leadership requires us to do something with our preaching that is different than we think about. So here's what I want to say. In time of great church change, preaching is not leadership. Preaching serves leadership. This is actually one of the most dramatic changes I think that's happened in the last 50 years or so. If you think about the great leaders of the 20th century, they were almost all orators. And actually, all the great leaders leading up to the 20th century, they were almost all orators, right? So you think of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and Kennedy's We Have Nothing to Fear But Fear Itself. That's Roosevelt. So we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Kennedy's Ask Not What Your Country Can Do for You. Winston Churchill, just goes on and on, right? Great orators and great leaders go together. And so you then think about the best church leaders, and very often they are also tremendous preachers. What's different today is when you think about really great leaders, very often our minds go to some different names, innovative leaders, entrepreneurs, people who can bring folks together across conflict. You think we could use the names of people that immediately come to mind, and not all of them are necessarily great orators. So in a church, what I want to talk about is the way that as you develop as a leader, one of the things you need to be able to understand is how preaching, and particularly faithful preaching, is one of the most important things for serving your leadership. It's not the same thing as leadership, but it serves leadership.